Hi, I'm Terrell Turner, the host of the Finance and Accounting Show. And today I have another great guest on because one of the things that you really look at as you're a growing business, and let's say you've raised capital and you're trying to scale, you're trying to take things to the next level. Well, you really want a finance partner who understands what you're trying to navigate, who understands how to help you really build the financial side and the fundamentals of that and just really scale to the next level. So you want to make sure that you're working with the right partners. So today's guest is going to be perfect for you if you are a growing business that has raised capital and you're trying to take things to the next level. So stay tuned when I bring my guest on. So without further ado, let me bring on my guest, Korey Cournoyer. Welcome to the show, Korey.
Hey Terrell, how are you? Thanks for having me.
I am great, man. I'm great. I have been looking forward to this conversation because I do think, one of the things that I tell a lot of people, and they ask me, like, why do you have other firms that do bookkeeping, CFO services, FP&A, accounting? Why do you have them on your show? And one of the things that I always tell them is that we are not the right fit for every type of business. But there are so many great firms out there, and one of the things that I love is firms that know, like, hey, here's who we help. So I've
Mhm.
been looking forward to having you on the show.
I appreciate that. I think that's one good thing that I appreciate about like our community is we are kind of like all open to talking to other firm owners and other firms, like learning from each other. Because I think that's how we can make it better for like our end customers, right? We learn from each other, we find out what works, like we're open about these things. So I appreciate that. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So now, for the people that may not be familiar with your background, can you tell us a little bit about, your background and kind of how you got where you are now?
Yeah, it's kind of a interesting journey, probably a little bit more unorthodox. I did not come from an accounting background, um, and I actually started going into school for pre-med, pre-dental, and through that, kind of got an internship. I was fascinated by entrepreneurship and like startups and like that. I think the allure that we all see with these fast-growing startups, right? I was fascinated by that from an early age and got an internship at a accounting firm that worked primarily with startups and like growing businesses. And through that, met a few connections and built some relationships and ended up at GrowthLab, where I'm at now. And I've been with GrowthLab for the past 8, 9 years now. Have kind of jumped around. I'm not an accountant by trade, so I've kind of focused more of my time on everything from the technology side of things, the sales and marketing, and most recently focused really on building out our automation department. So working with other firms on automation. So not an accountant. Kind of funny. But
No, I guess, how was that transition from, pre-med dental over to, accounting and business?
I've looking back, I've realized what it was though, right? Is that a lot of dentists or dental companies, dental practices, um, they're owner operated, right? Like they're actually small businesses more so than they are, hospital groups, if you will. So looking back, I think the realization now was that I was more so interested in the entrepreneurship around growing a dental practice. I've always interested in medicine, well-being, and stuff like that. So I think it was that connection of like the entrepreneurship with medicine that intrigued me. Um, so it's actually more of like a natural journey for me, shifting that mindset more towards like the non-medical medicine side of things. Um, so, but hindsight's 2020.
I can definitely see that because I mean, our firm, we work with a lot of law firms, and
Mhm.
that's one of the common things I see when it comes down to like professional type organizations to where And I imagine same thing with dentists, with doctors, with lawyers, or other fields that have some type of professional licensing or certification where there's a lot of money that rolls through their business, but they really don't have much concept of the finance and the accounting side of it.
No, they're the opposite, right? They are not business people primary for the most part, right? And I'm sure you see that often with law firms, right? Like these are um, they are I don't like to use this word, but like technicians by trade, right? So, like they are highly skilled in that technical aspect of it. But they oftentimes need the most help. So
Mhm.
that's where people like you
Awesome.
can jump in, right?
Awesome. Now, one of the things that I'm curious, as you talked about working with an accounting firm that, and their clientele that they focused on, you know, when you started working in that environment, was it something about that client base that
Mm,
really excited you? Because I know you mentioned about, there is a lot of excitement when it comes down to tech and software.
yeah.
But as you were doing the work, did like did the excitement of doing the work align with your expectation of what it was like to work with a software company?
Mm, that's a good question. Um, Yes and no, I'd say. I think one of the things that we focused on at Growth Lab was, we've always called ourselves like a a startup inside of a business, right? Like we try and embody that thoughtfulness around like being agile and being open to new ideas, right? And not trying to like systematize or processize everything too much. And so I think based on the culture that has been built, it's allowed me the opportunity to kind of bounce around, right? So whether it's the interest in the sales and marketing, or whether it's the focus on optimizing the technology side of things, or on the FP&A side, right? Like finding solutions like LiveFlow or Giraffe to like optimize kind of the workflow. Um, I think that's where we've done well, is focused on like being agile and open to new ideas rather than processizing and trying to mold it too much, if that makes sense, right?
And you bring up a really good point about, just finding those different technologies, those different tools. Because I remember, like, my background, I started accounting, corporate finance, working for like Fortune 500 companies. And one of the biggest pain points we run into a lot is like, I was working for General Electric, yeah,
Mhm.
hundreds of finance people within the division that I worked in. And then they had this small team that was solely dedicated to like, ERP enhancements or
Mhm.
technology enhancements because they're trying to go find, okay, what tools will help the rest of the team do their job better. And I can probably guess that, for a lot of your independent accounting firms and, your bookkeepers, your finance, your CFO firms, they don't have the luxury of, being able to hire a team that solely focuses on how do you help us upgrade our technology. So, you and I, we talked before. You guys do a little bit of work in that space. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what you do with other firms?
Yeah, we actually got into this space um, partly for two reasons. One, because we experienced those pain points ourselves, right? Like as a growing accounting firm over the past 8, 9 years, we experienced the pain of trying to build Zapiers, Zaps, and having them. We've all experienced this, right? Having them break and like, or not really function the way we want to, and just like banging our heads, like, what are we doing wrong, right? Like, but still having that constant pursuit of like, there has to be a better way, right? There has to be something out there, whether it's Zapier or another tool, right? And so part of it was our own experience and our own background of going through those struggles, and then transitioning and looking into new platforms, looking into new solutions, and realizing and hiring someone else internally to focus on development with us, and really shift that focus into like maybe we just need custom things, right? Like one of the things I know we talked about before was it's easy to see a new shiny object, right? That next app that looks like it can solve all of our problems, and then you implement it and it's not really what you think it was going to be, right? For a variety of reasons. And so, like coming full circle here, focusing on really like being methodical and thoughtful with development and the pain points that we went through, and then trying to help other firm owners go through those processes with our learnings behind them, right? That's really was the push into it.
I think that's an amazing thing because there are so many firms that I talk to. I mean, and I mean, I think there are a lot of firms that are overwhelmed, and there are firms that I've talked to where they may have multiple partners. They got a staff of 15 people, and they still feel overwhelmed because they're so consumed with trying to get the work done. They're like,
Mhm.
we don't have time to like go learn the technology, but we know the technology will help us do our jobs better. We just don't have the time to go learn it.
Yeah, I think it's also that's a great point too. Like it's probably the easiest area where smaller firms can find opportunities for themselves to scale, right? Because if you're at that inflection point with, a smaller firm with a handful of individuals, and you're trying to really scale, like it's a lot for a call it a 4-person team, 5-person team. Don't take those people like that size specifically, but like a 4-person team to add one more person, that's a 25% increase, right? Like that's tangible versus a 50-person firm adding one more person, right? And so automation tools are like connections, like custom built integrations, like things like that. Um, that's where I like to focus with firms because you can get such a substantial like return on it. Never mind like return on investment, just like substantial opportunity to scale with integrations, automations at that level, where you can really like transform your firm.
Mhm. Now, I guess as you're talking to different firms, about those possibilities of, building out automation within their firm, do you hear any common like roadblocks or
Mhm.
concerns that other firms have when you're telling them about, hey, the benefits and the potential of automation?
I'd say two. I'd say two that I come across the most. Um, One of them is more so from the rest of the team that I'm working with that may be, hesitant or resistant to automation because of the thinking that, their job may get replaced, which is an easy one to kind of say that easier said than done, right? But it's a easier one to kind of talk through because I'm not a believer in automation for like the replacement of people. I That's not what we are trying to do here. I think people leveraging technology and automation is the best combination rather than automation leveraging people. Um, and then, so that's probably the first one is hesitation and resistance that way. Uh, the second is many people want to jump to automation, right? Many people say, here's my pain point, automate it, take care of it for me. Sometimes you have to hit the brakes and say, do you really know your processes? Do you really know what happens before that task and after that task, and 5 steps before that task and 5 steps after? And a lot of firms don't, they think they know those processes, but they don't. And until you can really like map that full value stream and that full value proposition of like, what are you doing and what are the things that impact that one task you're trying to automate? And until you can see that full process, I don't suggest people automate. I tell them like we need to hit the brakes and let's pause before we do anything because you're just going to come back in a few months and be frustrated. So
That's a very interesting point, and I want to talk a little bit more about that because I've had this discussion even with some of the people within my team, and my kind of I guess say rule of thumb is like before I go into adopting a new tool, whether it's some type of workflow management type automation, is I want to be able to say, okay, all right, if we had to do this manually, what are the steps in the process? And it's just
yeah,
like, can we build out a framework? Because I'm like, I often feel, and I'm curious in your thoughts on it. I'm curious. I mean, because I tell my team, if we can't build out a framework and if you can't manually show me, like just pick one client or one situation, very small, let's walk from start to finish. If
mhm,
we aren't confident that we can do that, I'm like, how effective would we be at automating this? Like, what are we going to automate? And that's kind
yeah.
of my perspective. I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. The automation has to fit into a process rather than replacing the entire process, right? Because I don't believe that we're going to be able to automate everything, and we probably shouldn't automate everything, right? There's a lot of value in the human touch, especially to our customers, right? And so what we'll suggest is like, let's do a process mapping, right? Like, let's map your processes out and tell me all of the inputs, right? Because maybe your problem can actually be solved by changing something two steps ahead rather than just automating it, because maybe that automation is going to open a can of worms, right? Or who's the better questions like who's going to manage that automation? Who's responsible for it, right? I don't want people to think that you can just automate and then like out of sight, out of mind, like it's all taken care of. I don't have to think about it ever again, because I think we both know it's gonna come back to haunt you, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, now I guess, as you work with different firms, do you guys help with mapping out that process for them?
Yeah, we'll go through that process mapping. It's not where we like to focus. Of course, like I love the automation side of things, right? I want to jump to that, but yeah, sometimes it's the most beneficial for companies if they really don't. Here's kind of like how I'll think about it. Like Terrell, if you came to me and you're like, hey, I want to automate my onboarding process, right? Picking on that, I'd probably stop you, right? And say, like, let's do some process mapping, because it's a much different conversation for you to say, I want to automate my onboarding versus you saying, I want to automate my engagement agreement signatures, right? Like, that's super defined and super specific part of the process. Um, and that's where we can find value for you, right? When you just say, I want to automate this bucket, like that's too broad, and it's a slippery slope.
Mhm. It's one of those things that I think back to, as an accountant and studying for the CPA exam, and I think it might have been in the auditing section where you're like literally drawing out the boxes, the
Mhm.
squares, the
What it
triangle,
looks like,
the
yeah.
decision diamonds, and it's just
Mhm.
like I remember at the time, I would say naively saying out loud, "When am I ever going to use this?"
Yeah, I think we've all faced that, yeah. But, I think that the process maps can actually be some of the most valuable pieces of content, of information for firm owners, even if you're not going to automate, because what that may do is that will at least institutionalize your processes, whether you're going to automate them or not, right? Like, it defines and makes everyone in alignment on what the processes are. And then, like, think about retention, or think about your HR strategy, or think about hiring, right? Like, for a new hire, it's one thing to say, oh yeah, you're going to get trained by Joe or Sally, they're going to teach you everything, right? It's another thing for Joe or Sally that's going to train them to, here's your exact process map of where you are going to contribute value to the organization, right? Like, here's the things that your job is surrounded by, and here's how you can impact them. Here's like the flow. I think that I think that brings a lot of value to like employees and retention and training and development and, turnover, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an amazing point. I mean, because I think that is something that a lot of firms now do find themselves struggling with. Is like as they're trying to attract, new team members.
Hmm.
One of the things that I'm finding is that when hiring new team members, and I think this isn't just limited to like, a younger generation. I think a lot of people are looking at it as, what value is this position adding? Some people may be
Yeah.
looking at it from job security. Some people may just be looking at it as, I just don't want to be doing a mindless job. But
Hmm.
I think your point is amazing. Of if you can map out the process, you can actually let people know, like, hey, here are the value points that you're going to add
Yeah.
to what's happening in the business. I think that's an amazing point.
Yeah, and then they can see, here's how I am, like, here's how I can influence, and it can also be, here's how my job contributes to the next person, right? Like, if I don't follow my process, then everyone else after me is also, in a challenging spot too. So, yeah, whether you automate or not, like, I think that's a worthwhile exercise for firms to do, um, for a lot of those reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can think that, probably as a leader now of just like it makes those performance discussions a lot
Mm,
easier because there is clarity around what they're supposed to be doing. And I
yeah.
remember like the last job that I had before I started my firm, you know, there's an employee like I had adopted a team. So there was an employee on the team that felt like they were ready for the next promotion. And so like I hadn't been there that long. So I talked to, the CFO, what CFO's thoughts was, and the CFO had a different opinion about it. And I'm just like, okay, all right, how am I supposed to go communicate that to this
Mhm.
person of like where the gaps are? Because there was like it wasn't very clear. It's just like, well, we're saying no based on this subjective standard. And if the person asks, well, what can I do different? Well, I don't know. Make me feel more comfortable.
Yeah. And then for like for scaling firms, right? Like growing firms, um, it makes you rethink your HR strategy potentially in terms of like if you start building those process maps and those processes out, like does this process or does this section of a process does that really fit a job description? Like tie it back like you're kind of I think as you're putting it, like tie it back to the job description, tie it back to like your hiring strategy. Like if if your admin assistant is taking care of like six different processes that you could probably split up, right? Like you can begin to you have a framework for it now, right? So
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I know we've talked a lot about, the automation segment of the business, what you guys are doing there at Growth Labs, which I think is amazing. I want to jump back a little bit on, for the clients that you guys are working with. You and I we talked about, clients, that they're scaling, they're growing. I mean, because I would say anyone who's raising capital, they're doing it to scale and grow. You don't go through the grueling process
mm,
of raising capital just to say you did it.
I hope not. Yeah.
You're really trying. I mean, you're trying to grow. So, can you tell us a little bit about the role that Growth Lab plays as a part of their team and as a part of that process for your clients?
Yeah, for sure. And that's really like that's the I'll call it the bread and butter of what we really do, right? This automation, this process mapping, that's newer to the firm. But we really started as an accounting and bookkeeping firm. Um, and so how we've kind of tried to explain ourselves is that we call ourselves a finance as a service firm, where we really try and take your entire finance team if you're looking to outsource it and bring it under one roof, right? So your
Gotcha.
accounting, bookkeeping is right. Your FP&A and CFO, and then your tax. And kind of, I'd say our really our sweet spot is that FP&A and CFO work. As you know, you came from an FP&A background, right? And so that FP&A is really we find a lot of growing firms come to us or growing companies come to us and say, "I need a CFO," and it's like, well, you've raised a $500,000 pre-revenue. Um, you don't really have an accounting team in place. Do you really need a CFO, or do you need someone to help you with modeling and cash flows, right? Because that's probably more in the FP&A side of things, right? I think CFO is just that, maybe not trigger word, but it's like it's the easy scapegoat, right? Maybe not the right word to use there, but so really working with the companies on the FP&A side to help them really manage their cash flow, manage their modeling, manage their reporting out to investors, and then bringing on the CFO work once they've hit a stage of really needing that consulting, if you will.
Mhm. I think that makes a lot of sense because I will say, for some of the companies that I've worked with, or some of the companies that I just have different friends that have worked with in different finance levels from CFO down to, accountant, is that a lot of times when those companies are growing very fast, like the accounting function or the finance function is like the last one that they tend to hire for.
Mhm.
Um, but it's like, and I get it because they don't have the cash flow to, go and hire a CFO because it's not, I mean, I've heard people say, hey, we need a CFO. And it's just like, well, let me give you an idea of the price range if you're trying to hire a full-time CFO. And then they're like, oh, maybe we need something different. Like, yeah, you probably do.
Or worse yet, you find that CFO becoming I hate to say it, but like an overpriced bookkeeper, right?
Yeah.
If they don't have the underlying support in place.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, I guess, how do you guys find that, what's the response from like clients when kind of help them understand like, hey, here's the value we play, whether it's helping provide that outsource accounting, FP&A function as you're working your way up to, hiring a CFO. When they start to see the value and they start to see how that plays out, what's some of the responses that they give you, or the customer feedback that they give
This is going to sound like I'm shooting myself in the foot for a second, but I'd say one of the things that internally we kind of, judge ourselves on and really like determine our quality on is really if companies outgrow us, right? Sounds kind of counterintuitive maybe, but if we are helping companies, right? Because our sweet spot is really working with companies up until they've raised maybe 20 million, 25 million in funding, or sometimes around that revenue mark, but it's really like dependent on the type of business, right? But if a company outgrows us and they've been with us for a while, right? 4 plus years, like that's a win in our books, right? Like that's success to us because we've helped them achieve that. I think the feedback we've heard from companies is really like when they've gotten to that arbitrary numbers here, but they've gotten to that $10 million mark, for example, and maybe at that point they do need a CFO in house, right? Or they do need to bring in the bookkeeping in house. We don't want to, turn a blind eye to them and just kind of kick them off to the curb. We'll work with them, right? Like we've worked with many companies to help them vet the CFO that they bring on, to help them vet the bookkeeper that they bring on, and then work with them, right? You do the bookkeeping, we'll do the controllership, until you get to a point where you need a controller in house, right? Or until you need the FP&A team in house. And that's probably the best kind of relationship building and kind of the best feedback we've gotten from companies we've worked with is our ability to like work with them to help them find like the best solution, right? Because it's win-win if we can kind of stay around with them and help them grow and transition. And it's a win for them because they get to make a slower transition versus just, a clean cut into their own in-house team, right? And that's where we've been. I think that's where we've been had the best feedback.
Nice, nice. That's always good to hear. I mean, I think it is, the fact that you guys are paying attention to that feedback, and I love the idea of, like I said, just really the part of your goal is to help your clients outgrow you. I think that's where you know that you're focused on adding the most value to them.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Now, if people are interested in finding you guys online, learning more about, Growth Labs, where should they look for you guys online?
Check us out at growthlabfinancial.com, or we share a lot of content on our blog. You can find a lot more about our automation and our process mapping on our website as well. Or reach out to us on YouTube, LinkedIn. You can pretty much find us on all of the socials now.
Awesome. I love it. I love it. Well, before we wrap up, one final question that I love asking every guest that comes on. I mean, because we've talked about a lot of very interesting things that I think would help a lot of, finance and accounting professionals, firm owners, a lot of business owners as well. So if you were talking to someone and said, hey, I was on the finance and accounting show with Terrell, you're going to go listen to my conversation that I had with Terrell. Hey, here are two big takeaways that I think you should draw from that conversation. What would your two big takeaways be?
Oof. I'd say number one is thoughtful automation, right? Not automating for the sake of automating. Don't just automate solely because you think it's going to solve your problems or reduce your time. Because if you're not thoughtful, it's going to do the exact opposite. I'd say that for number one. And then number two is regardless of it, whether we're talking about automation or finance, accounting, like um, I'd say like this is still, everyone's still human, right? Like these are still, we're all people, right? And whether you're automating something or whether you're working with someone on FP&A and CFO, like this is still a people business, and building those relationships, building, rapport with your peers, like that's going to pay you the most dividends, regardless of, what service, what industry, etc.
Awesome. I love it. Well, Korey, thank you so much for being an amazing guest. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Thanks, Terrell. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Finance and Accounting Show. If you like what you heard, don't be selfish. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and then share this with a friend, because you know a business owner that could definitely use this insight. So be sure to hit that subscribe button, share it with a friend, and turn on the notification bell so you get all the updates when we release a new episode.